In the imagination of most people, the word Sparta calls forth images of bronze-clad warriors, crimson cloaks billowing behind them, and shields locked tight in perfect formation. It is the story every schoolchild learns, the indomitable hoplites, the ferocity of Thermopylae, the unyielding discipline that made Sparta the terror of the ancient Greek world. Yet behind the marble columns of their temples and the bronze statues lining their public squares, another story was unfolding. One that never made it into heroic poetry. One that was whispered in private, buried under layers of myth and selective memory. It is the story of Sparta's women, and of wedding nights that felt more like invasions than unions. The setting is stark. A Spartan household, outwardly simple, its walls bare of ornament, reflecting a society that prized austerity over luxury. As dusk settles over the valley of the Eurotas River, the city grows quieter, save for the distant sounds of men drilling in the barracks. But inside certain homes, a different kind of preparation is underway. A young girl, barely a woman, often no more than 16, is being led to what will be called her wedding chamber. To outsiders, this would seem like a sacred rite of passage. Yet for her, the chamber is nothing less than a prison cell awaiting a sentence. For centuries, historians and even popular culture have painted Spartan women as unusually free compared to their Athenian sisters. They ran, they trained, they managed households. They were described as outspoken, even proud. But the archaeological record and a closer reading of scattered ancient sources tell us a more complicated truth. The freedoms often celebrated were a facade. At the heart of Spartan marriage lay a ritual so brutal, so systematized, that it transformed the beginning of a young woman's married life into a state-sanctioned trauma. Imagine the dread that settled over her as shadows lengthened. Where other Greek cities lit lamps and filled their homes with songs on wedding nights, Sparta embraced silence. No laughter, no feasts, no procession of friends carrying gifts. Instead, the bride waited in darkness, her hair freshly shorn, an act that stripped away both her girlhood and her pride. She wore clothes not her own, coarse, oversized garments made for men, meant not to empower but to reduce her, to blur her identity until she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Each detail was calculated. Each step served a purpose. Her individuality was erased so that she could re-emerge as something new, not a partner, but property. The chamber itself reflected this transformation. Unlike the decorated nuptial rooms of Athens, adorned with symbols of fertility and festivity, Spartan wedding chambers were stark. For bare walls of stone, unheated floors, no windows to admit moonlight. The air was heavy, stifling, designed to smother rather than soothe. Hours would pass in silence. No comfort of family, no reassuring words of a mother or sister. Only the girl, the darkness, and her growing terror. Some excavated walls still bear the faint scratches of fingernails clawing against stone, silent testimony to the desperation of brides long gone. Shredded fragments of rough tunics, unearthed from burial contexts, suggest attempts to peel away the hateful disguise, to reclaim at least a sliver of identity before the inevitable knock on the door. This was not a private ordeal, it was a public lesson. The cries that often erupted once the ritual reached its climax were meant to be heard by the neighborhood. Ancient writers, in rare moments of candor, record that screams echoing through the streets were not considered shameful. They were confirmation that the ritual had worked as intended. They signaled to the community that another young woman had been broken, that another household had been established on the foundation of fear and domination. In this sense, the Spartan wedding night was less a personal moment than a civic demonstration, woven into the fabric of a militarized state. For the young girl at the center of this ritual, the fear was all-consuming. It was not just the fear of physical violation, though that was real enough, but the deeper terror of knowing she had no escape. She had been raised from childhood to believe her suffering was honorable, that silence in the face of pain was the highest virtue. Religious ceremonies had conditioned her to endure without protest, to associate virtue with submission. By the time she sat alone in that chamber, she understood instinctively what was expected of her, not to resist, not to cry out for help, but to yield. To accept that her body was no longer her own, that her worth would be measured only by the sons she could bear for Sparta's armies. To the men of Sparta, hardened by years of training, this night was a continuation of the same discipline that had shaped them since boyhood. Marriage was not about affection or companionship. It was about control. The state had taught them that love was a weakness, that personal bonds could undermine the unity of the phalanx. And so, in the dim light of the wedding chamber, the groom arrived not as a partner but as a conqueror. The symbols of invasion were unmistakable. Sometimes he entered by breaking down the door, sometimes through a window, as if storming an enemy stronghold. The bride's body became the territory, her silence the surrender. And yet, the cruelty of this ritual was not simply the violence itself. It was its permanence. For in those first hours of marriage, the foundation was laid for a lifetime of fear. The intimacy that might have blossomed between two young people was poisoned at the root. The bond that should have been built on trust was instead anchored in domination. What Sparta gained in obedience, it lost in humanity. And what it demanded from its women, it never returned. When we listen closely to the echoes of history, the clamor of Spartan shields and spears begins to fade. What remains are the cries of those whose voices were never meant to be heard. Their pain is written not in epic poetry but in the silence of neglected graves, in bones that bear the marks of repeated childbirth and malnutrition, in the fragments of rough fabric that once chafed against young skin. These are the true chronicles of Sparta, less glamorous but more revealing. Part 1 ends with these haunting questions. What kind of society builds its strength on the suffering of its daughters? How could a people so feared abroad be so merciless within their own homes? The answers lie not only in the practices of one militaristic city-state, but in the larger truth that any civilization which sacrifices love and dignity for power plants the seeds of its own destruction. And so, as the screams fade into silence behind those marble columns, the story of Sparta's women begins, not in celebration, but in fear. And that fear will shape not only their lives, but the destiny of an entire people. The story of the Spartan wedding night cannot be understood in isolation. It was not the cruelty of one household or the whim of a single husband. It was the natural product of a society deliberately designed around violence and control. To see why young brides faced such terror, we must look beyond the private chamber and into the machinery of the Spartan state itself. From its earliest foundations, Sparta was unlike any other Greek city-state. Where Athens celebrated philosophy and debate, Corinth prized trade, and Thebes cultivated alliances, Sparta forged itself into a single-purpose engine of war. The land of Laconia, fertile yet vulnerable, required constant defense against both external enemies and the vast population of enslaved helots who worked the fields. Fear of rebellion and invasion drove Sparta toward a social order that valued discipline above freedom, conformity above individuality. Every law, every ritual, every relationship was reshaped to serve this militaristic vision. Children were the raw material of this system. From birth, they belonged not to their parents but to the state. Newborns were inspected by elders who determined whether they were strong enough to live. Those judged too weak were abandoned to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. It was an early lesson in the cold arithmetic of survival: the community mattered, the individual did not. For those who survived, childhood was short and joyless. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their mothers and entered the agoge, the Spartan military training system. There, they learned to fight, endure hunger, and obey orders without question. Compassion was discouraged, even punished, while cruelty was rewarded as a sign of strength. Women, too, were shaped by this system. Unlike in Athens, where girls lived mostly secluded lives, Spartan girls were expected to train their bodies. They ran races, threw javelins, and exercised in public. But this was not a celebration of equality. The purpose was entirely utilitarian: to create strong bodies capable of surviving multiple pregnancies, producing children resilient enough to grow into warriors. Their value was measured not in their voices or their minds, but in the sons they could bear. Behind the stories of athletic Spartan women, so often romanticized, lay a darker reality: their physical training was simply another form of state control, a preparation for lives of reproduction and suffering. The structure of Spartan life reinforced this philosophy. Men did not live with their wives in the way families did elsewhere in Greece. Instead, they remained in communal barracks with their fellow soldiers until the age of 30. Even married men were required to eat their daily meals with comrades rather than family. Romantic bonds, domestic joys, and shared household life were sacrificed to the needs of the army. Love between husband and wife was not just discouraged, it was seen as a potential threat to loyalty within the phalanx. The state could not allow a warrior to prioritize affection for his wife over obedience to his commanders. Thus, even within marriage, intimacy was carefully stifled. In this context, the Spartan wedding night takes on a chilling clarity. It was not an aberration but a reflection of a broader logic. Intimacy itself was dangerous, and had to be controlled through fear and domination. The state did not simply tolerate violence within marriage, it mandated it. By ensuring that the first moments of a couple's life together were marked by terror and submission, the authorities guaranteed that personal bonds would be built not on love but on hierarchy. The husband became the unquestioned commander, the wife his subordinate. The relationship mirrored the structure of the army itself, where loyalty flowed upward and individuality was crushed. Foreign visitors recognized the strangeness of this system. Persian envoys, accustomed to opulent weddings filled with music and joy, wrote with unease about Spartan unions that seemed more like bureaucratic transactions than celebrations. Egyptian traders noted that Spartan brides were stripped of their femininity in ways that shocked even cultures with their own forms of patriarchy. Compared to the rest of the Mediterranean world, Sparta's practices stood out as uniquely severe, uniquely joyless. Where others saw marriage as at least partly a personal partnership, the Spartans saw it as another extension of the military apparatus. Archaeological discoveries reinforce this picture. Excavations of Spartan barracks show clear evidence of men's prolonged separation from their families, with personal items, dining facilities, and sleeping quarters arranged for groups rather than individuals. Meanwhile, burial sites of women reveal skeletal damage from repeated childbirth, stress fractures from physical strain, and signs of malnutrition during pregnancy. These findings confirm what the written sources suggest: the so-called empowerment of Spartan women came at a devastating cost. They were not liberated citizens but state-owned vessels, their bodies exploited to sustain the war machine. This brutal arrangement was not accidental. It was the deliberate result of reforms attributed to Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver of Sparta, who around the 7th century BCE reshaped the city's laws and customs. Whether or not he was a real individual, the system ascribed to him was ruthlessly consistent. Individual happiness was declared irrelevant, even dangerous. The only measure of value was contribution to the state's military power. And so, rituals that elsewhere celebrated human connection were in Sparta inverted into demonstrations of control. Birth, marriage, even death were stripped of personal meaning and refashioned into instruments of discipline. To modern eyes, this system is unsettling in its efficiency. Every stage of life was planned to break down personal bonds and replace them with loyalty to the collective. Boys were severed from their mothers. Husbands were severed from their wives. Wives were severed from their own sense of identity. In a sense, the wedding night ritual was the perfect symbol of Sparta. It transformed what should have been the most intimate, voluntary act into a public instrument of fear. It reduced human beings to roles, stripped of choice, pressed into service of the phalanx. And yet, beneath this brutal logic lay contradictions. By seeking absolute control, the state sowed the seeds of fragility. A society built on fear cannot nurture trust. Families fractured under pressure. Women carried invisible wounds, emotional as well as physical, that undermined their ability to contribute to the household economy. Children grew up in homes overshadowed by tension, learning early that violence was normal. In its obsession with strength, Sparta cultivated weakness at its core. When we picture the city's famous warriors marching off to battle, we must also imagine the women left behind, scarred, silenced, and treated as resources rather than partners. Their suffering was not incidental, it was foundational. Without understanding this hidden half of Spartan life, we cannot fully grasp why the city that once dominated Greece eventually collapsed under its own weight. To understand the wedding night in Sparta, one must recognize that it did not begin with the groom stepping into the chamber. It began years earlier, when the bride was still a child. The seeds of terror were planted long before the ritual itself, carefully cultivated through social conditioning, religious practices, and cultural indoctrination. By the time a young Spartan woman entered her wedding chamber, she was already prepared, mentally, physically, and emotionally, not for love, but for submission. From childhood, Spartan girls were taught a single lesson: their highest honor lay not in their own happiness, but in suffering silently for the good of the state. Festivals and ceremonies reinforced this idea. While their brothers trained to endure hunger and pain in the agoge, the girls participated in their own rituals of endurance. Some ceremonies required them to withstand lashes or physical trials without crying out. Priests and elders praised silence as a virtue, teaching them that to endure pain without complaint was a mark of true Spartan womanhood. Each cut of the whip, each withheld tear, was a rehearsal for the silence expected on their wedding night. This conditioning was reinforced in the stories told around hearths and temples. Young girls heard tales not of romantic love, but of mothers who sacrificed their children for Sparta's glory, of wives who endured cruelty without protest, of women who measured their worth only by the warriors they bore. When girls reached adolescence, the message was clear: their bodies belonged not to them, but to the state. Marriage was not a choice. It was an assignment. As the day of the wedding approached, the preparations became more brutal and explicit. One of the most symbolic acts was the cutting of the bride's hair. In Greek culture, a woman's hair was her pride, a symbol of fertility and beauty. To shear it violently was to strip away her femininity in one devastating gesture. Accounts from ancient sources describe young women weeping as their long locks fell to the floor, their tears mixing with the blood from scalps nicked by rough blades. This was no gentle trimming, it was a calculated humiliation. By destroying their crowning glory, the ritual announced the end of their girlhood, the death of their individuality, and their transformation into breeding vessels for the state. The second phase was cross-dressing. After the shearing, the bride was forced to wear men's clothing. But this was not the empowering adoption of masculine attire. It was a deliberate act of dehumanization. The garments were oversized, often several sizes too large, made of coarse, scratchy fabric that irritated the skin. Instead of making the girl appear strong, the effect was to make her look childlike and helpless, drowning in fabric that did not belong to her. Textile analysis of burial goods confirms the roughness of these garments, ill-fitting tunics and sandals designed more for discomfort than dignity. Foreign observers were horrified by these practices. A Persian diplomat visiting Sparta in the 5th century BCE wrote of witnessing brides stripped of their femininity, describing the process as the systematic destruction of grace. Egyptian traders, accustomed to weddings filled with music and jewelry, compared the preparations to the conditioning of prisoners before interrogation. To outsiders, it was clear, this was not a marriage ritual, but a form of psychological warfare. The psychological toll of this transformation was immense. Modern analysts of trauma recognize forced cross-dressing as a tactic of identity destruction. By forcing a young woman to dress like a man, while simultaneously making her appear vulnerable and childlike, Spartan society was creating deliberate confusion. The bride's mind, already fragile from years of indoctrination, now faced a chaotic collision between her self-image and the role imposed upon her. She no longer knew who she was. Was she a child? A man? A woman? In this disoriented state, she became more susceptible to the terror that awaited her in the chamber. These preparations culminated in isolation. Once dressed and shorn, the bride was placed in the darkened wedding chamber. The room itself was designed to magnify fear. Unlike the decorated nuptial rooms of Athens, adorned with flowers and fertility symbols, the Spartan chamber resembled a prison cell. For bare walls of stone. A single heavy door. No windows, no warmth, no decoration. Archaeological evidence suggests the floors were unheated even in winter, amplifying the cold that seeped into the bride's bones as she waited. Inside, sensory deprivation played its role. No sounds penetrated the thick stone walls. No light filtered in. Even air circulation was minimal, leaving the chamber stifling, tomb-like. Medical texts from the ancient world describe how prolonged isolation in darkness could cause hallucinations and panic. For a young woman already traumatized by the rituals of haircutting and cross-dressing, these hours alone in the suffocating dark would have pushed many to the edge of breakdown. Excavations have uncovered scratch marks on stone walls, signs that desperate brides clawed at the chamber in fear, seeking escape. Fragments of torn tunics found in some contexts suggest attempts to rid themselves of the hateful male garments, only to realize that doing so left them even more exposed. The symbolism of this isolation was profound. The girl entered the chamber as an individual, terrified but still herself. By the time her husband arrived, she had been stripped, humiliated, dehumanized, and left alone in sensory torment. The stage was set for the final act, the violent entry of the groom, whose arrival would complete the transformation. But before he appeared, the silence was its own tormentor. In that stillness, fear grew louder with every passing hour. The young bride knew what was coming. She had seen it before. She had heard the screams of other women echoing through the night, had watched neighbors weep silently the next morning. She had been told since childhood that her purpose was to endure. Yet nothing could truly prepare her for the moment when the door would burst open and her body would become the battlefield of Sparta's social order. The preparations for the wedding night reveal the calculated nature of Spartan society's cruelty. This was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was deliberate psychological conditioning, aimed at ensuring total submission from the very first night of marriage. The bride's hair was cut to sever her from her past. Her clothing humiliated her into confusion. The chamber broke her spirit with fear and isolation. Every element was part of a design, a process that turned individuals into resources, women into wombs, marriages into instruments of control. And so, by the time the groom entered, the battle had already been won. The woman before him was no longer whole. She was fragmented, stripped, reshaped into something the state could control. Her silence, her tears, her trembling hands were proof of the system's success. The conquest of her body was not merely his, it was Sparta's. The preparations, then, were not just physical acts. They were the first blows of a war waged not on foreign soil, but within the walls of Spartan homes. A war against individuality, against love, against the human spirit itself. And the victims, unseen and unheard, were the young women whose lives began not with celebration, but with terror. The door was always the final barrier. For hours, the bride sat in silence inside the dark chamber, her hair cropped, her body wrapped in coarse garments, her spirit worn thin by isolation. But the moment the heavy wooden door creaked open, the ritual entered its most brutal stage. The man who stepped through that threshold was not a lover. He was a conqueror, a warrior trained to subdue, entering the room as though it were enemy territory. Spartan men were not raised to be husbands in the sense other Greeks would have recognized. They had spent their youth and early adulthood in barracks, living among fellow soldiers, their identities forged entirely through military discipline. Tenderness was not part of their training. Empathy was a liability. From the age of 7 until 30, their existence had revolved around drills, combat exercises, and psychological conditioning designed to erase hesitation in battle. What remained was a hardened exterior, a man who viewed control and domination as natural instincts. On the wedding night, this training was deliberately channeled into the marriage ritual. Before entering the chamber, many grooms took part in preparations meant to heighten aggression. Ancient accounts describe drinking ceremonies where wine was mixed with herbs to dull inhibition and sharpen violence. Groups of men sang war chants, pounding their chests, working themselves into a frenzy that blurred the line between battle and marriage. For them, this was not the beginning of companionship. It was an operation, as calculated as any raid. Age differences played a crucial role. Brides were typically 16 to 18 years old, barely past childhood, while grooms were in their early 30s. The gap was not accidental. A man at the peak of his strength and confidence faced a girl whose life had been marked by silence and submission. The imbalance ensured that the woman could not resist, physically or psychologically. The state engineered these pairings to magnify dominance. What might have been natural nervousness in a young husband was replaced by certainty in an older soldier, drilled for years to seize and subjugate. The entry itself symbolized conquest. In many cases, the groom did not simply walk through the door. He broke it down or entered through a window, a performance echoing the storming of a city's defenses. The symbolism was unmistakable: the bride was a fortress, and her body the territory to be claimed. This act blurred the line between war and intimacy, reducing marriage to a military campaign. The bride, already stripped of her identity, became the spoils of battle. Inside the chamber, the violence was not hidden. Ancient sources, though fragmentary and often reluctant, describe the encounters in terms modern readers would recognize as assault. The bride's cries, when they came, were not signs of scandal but of success. They carried through the streets of Spartan neighborhoods, audible reminders to every family of what awaited their daughters. The community did not intervene. The screams were part of the ritual, evidence that another young woman had been broken into obedience. For the bride, the ordeal was twofold. The physical pain was real, intensified by the roughness of a man who had spent his life suppressing gentleness. But the deeper wound was psychological. This was the moment she fully understood her place in the Spartan system. She was not a partner, not an equal, not even truly an individual. She was property, valuable only for the children she could produce, expendable if she resisted. Any illusions of romance were shattered in those first hours. What remained was submission. Some ancient accounts suggest that brides were told explicitly not to resist. Elders advised them that silence was strength, that endurance was duty. Resistance could lead not only to harsher treatment but to public humiliation or exile. In a society where the state's authority reached into every household, disobedience was more dangerous than pain. And so, most endured quietly, internalizing their trauma as part of their new identity. The aftermath was equally grim. In the days following, many young women withdrew into themselves, displaying symptoms that today we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to trust their husbands were common. Yet in Spartan society, these symptoms were not signs of harm but of proper submission. A silent, withdrawn wife was considered ideal, her broken spirit a guarantee of loyalty. For those who dared to complain, consequences were swift. Exile or further abuse awaited anyone who challenged the ritual. The grooms, meanwhile, were praised. Their violence was not considered cruelty but duty. Just as they subdued helots in the fields or enemies on the battlefield, so too were they expected to subdue their wives. The line between private and public life dissolved. Every act of domination reinforced the authority of the state. The household became a miniature reflection of the army, the husband as commander, the wife as subordinate, the children as resources. It is difficult for us to grasp the normalization of such violence. Yet for Spartans, this was the system's genius. By embedding brutality into the most intimate of human relationships, it guaranteed that fear would govern every corner of life. A woman who had been broken on her wedding night was unlikely to rebel against the state. A husband who had learned to dominate his household was unlikely to question his commanders. Control was total, reaching from the battlefield to the bedroom. And yet, cracks appeared even in this iron system. Some women, though scarred, formed bonds of solidarity with one another. Friendships between women offered moments of comfort, whispered conversations in marketplaces or at wells where they could acknowledge their suffering. These connections, while not openly resistant, were small acts of survival in a society designed to isolate them. But for most, the trauma of that night never faded. It shaped their marriages, their motherhood, and their sense of self. The Spartan wedding night, then, was not merely a private tragedy. It was a public policy. By turning warriors into invaders of their own homes, the state weaponized intimacy itself. The screams that echoed through the night were not accidental, they were part of the design. And in those screams lay the true cost of Sparta's obsession with power, the destruction of love, trust, and dignity within its own walls. The screams of a Spartan bride on her wedding night did not fade with the morning. They lingered, echoing in her memory, resurfacing with every glance toward her husband, with every step into the household that was never truly her own. The trauma was not an isolated moment but the foundation of her marriage. It was the beginning of a life defined by fear, silence, and endurance. And in time, it became more than personal suffering. It became the legacy of an entire society. In the days that followed, most women withdrew into themselves. The bright curiosity of youth dimmed into quiet compliance. Some stopped speaking except when necessary. Others avoided eye contact, their shoulders bent, their movements tentative. Modern psychology would recognize the signs, symptoms of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares haunted their sleep, sudden noises made them flinch, and trust became a fragile, unreachable thing. Yet in Sparta, none of these were seen as illnesses. They were treated as proof that the system had worked. A subdued wife was a loyal wife. Pregnancy, which in other cultures might have offered joy or at least a sense of purpose, became another source of dread. Each new life carried both hope and terror. A son, once born, would be taken from her at age 7 to begin his own brutal training. A daughter, in time, would be subjected to the same preparations, the same chamber, the same screams. For mothers, the cradle was not a symbol of continuity or affection. It was a reminder that the cycle of trauma would never end. The physical toll was staggering. Archaeological studies of Spartan women's remains reveal bones scarred by repeated childbirth, pelvic fractures from difficult labors, and stress markers consistent with malnutrition during pregnancy. Despite their famed physical training, Spartan women lived shorter lives on average than their Athenian counterparts. Their bodies, conditioned for endurance, had been pushed past their limits, used up in the service of a state that measured their worth only by how many soldiers they could produce. But the greater toll was psychological. Imagine living in a household where the person you feared most was also the one you were bound to forever. Husbands, shaped by decades of military training, rarely showed tenderness. To them, affection was weakness. Violence was discipline. In this atmosphere, intimacy never healed, it only reopened wounds. For many women, marriage was not companionship but captivity. Some coped by retreating inward, building walls within their minds. They learned to dissociate, to separate their thoughts from their bodies during moments of fear or pain. Others sought refuge in religion, erecting small household shrines to goddesses of protection and healing. Archaeologists have found tokens hidden in corners, charms buried under floors, evidence of desperate prayers whispered into the silence. These were not public rituals sanctioned by the state but private acts of survival, attempts to carve out some sliver of control in lives otherwise consumed by obedience. There were women who found comfort in one another. Bonds formed in quiet marketplaces or at water wells, where shared glances and whispered words provided solace. These relationships, not necessarily romantic, offered something precious, understanding. Only another Spartan woman could truly grasp the weight of silence, the meaning of those first screams in the wedding chamber. In their company, at least for a moment, the burden grew lighter. Yet even these small refuges were fragile. The state encouraged surveillance, and women who spoke too openly risked punishment not only for themselves but for their families. Resistance, when it did occur, was rare and perilous. A woman who dared to complain about her treatment could be exiled, stripped of her place in the community, or subjected to harsher abuse. Silence was survival. Submission was safety. And so, the legacy of pain passed quietly from one generation to the next. Children grew up in these fractured households. Sons saw mothers flinch when fathers entered the room. Daughters watched their mothers endure humiliation in silence. These early lessons normalized violence, teaching children that domination was not just acceptable but expected. The home, instead of being a sanctuary, became an extension of the state's control, another arena where power was enforced through fear. In this way, the trauma of a single wedding night multiplied, spreading through families, shaping the very fabric of Spartan society. The economic consequences were real, though seldom acknowledged. A woman consumed by fear and trauma was less able to manage a household effectively, less able to provide stability for her children. She might suffer from chronic illness, depression, or withdrawal, limiting her productivity. The state, so focused on military dominance, failed to see that by breaking half its population, it was weakening the very foundation of its society. Strong soldiers could not emerge from broken homes without cost. Foreign observers noted the contrast. In Athens, marriages were also arranged, and women had fewer rights than men, yet weddings were celebrated with joy and feasts. In Egypt and Babylon, laws at least offered women some protection against cruelty. In Rome, even under strict patriarchy, extreme violence could be challenged in court. Sparta stood alone in institutionalizing marital violence, embedding it into its laws, defending it as necessary for social order. What others saw as abuse, Sparta enshrined as policy. And yet, history suggests that the consequences were profound. Over time, the population of Sparta declined. The rigid system that demanded endless sacrifice from women eroded its own base. Higher infant mortality, maternal deaths, and the psychological damage inflicted on families weakened the community from within. By the later centuries, Sparta struggled to maintain the numbers needed for its armies. Scholars today argue that the state's obsession with control, its relentless traumatization of women, was not merely a moral failing but a strategic one. A society that sacrifices its own people cannot sustain itself forever. Still, within this darkness, there were glimpses of resilience. Spartan women, despite their suffering, left traces of endurance. Some carved small inscriptions invoking goddesses. Others crafted jewelry, sometimes hidden, as symbols of personal identity preserved against erasure. These artifacts, found centuries later, whisper of lives that refuse to be entirely consumed by the state's machinery. They remind us that even in oppression, the human spirit seeks ways to endure. The silent pain of Spartan women did not remain locked within the walls of their homes. It seeped outward, shaping the very character of the city-state. A society built on fear within its most intimate relationships inevitably carried that fear into every other aspect of life. What began as private trauma became a public weakness. The systematic breaking of trust between husbands and wives poisoned the foundation upon which all communities depend, the family. In most ancient societies, even those with strict hierarchies, the household was a place of cooperation. In Athens, though women had limited rights, marriage was viewed as a partnership in which husband and wife worked together to sustain the oikos, the household economy. In Egypt, legal codes allowed wives to seek redress for cruelty and provided avenues for divorce. Even in Rome, under its famously patriarchal system, some protections existed against extreme abuse. These arrangements, while far from equitable, at least acknowledged that a family required mutual trust to function. Sparta rejected this principle. By mandating violence and submission on the wedding night, the state deliberately sabotaged the possibility of trust between spouses. Husbands learned to view their wives not as allies but as subordinates to be controlled. Wives, in turn, learned to fear rather than confide in their husbands. The result was a society where the most basic unit, the family, was fractured from its very beginning. Archaeological evidence reveals this divide. Excavations of Spartan homes suggest separate living spaces for men and women, reflecting the limited contact between spouses. Husbands spent most of their time in barracks, even after marriage, while wives managed households in isolation. This physical separation mirrored the emotional distance cultivated by fear. Instead of bonds of intimacy, Spartan families were marked by silence and suspicion. The consequences extended to children. Sons grew up in homes where their mothers trembled at the sound of their father's footsteps. They absorbed the lesson that violence was natural, that authority was enforced through fear rather than respect. By the time they entered the Agoge at 7 years old, they already knew what obedience meant. Daughters, meanwhile, watched their mothers endure humiliation in silence. They learned early that their own futures would be no different. Every glance, every whispered conversation, reminded them of the fate that awaited. The cycle of trauma perpetuated itself, generation after generation. Mothers who had been broken on their own wedding nights could not shield their daughters. Fathers, conditioned to dominate, could not imagine another way to lead a household. Children grew into adults who replicated the same patterns, each family a mirror of the state's authoritarian structure. In this way, the violence of a single night spread across decades, embedding itself in the cultural DNA of Sparta. The wider social consequences were profound. Without trust within families, there was little space for creativity, innovation, or emotional resilience. A society that silences half its population deprives itself of half its potential. Spartan women, stripped of agency and crushed by trauma, could not contribute fully to the civic life of their community. Their talents, their intellect, their capacity for joy, all were buried under the weight of fear. This suppression weakened Sparta in ways less visible than battlefield losses but equally destructive. While Athens produced philosophers, playwrights, and statesmen, Sparta produced soldiers, and little else. Its cultural output was thin, its intellectual life stunted, its economy fragile. By binding every aspect of life to the demands of war, Sparta limited its capacity to adapt, to innovate, to survive change. The collapse of trust within households mirrored a broader inability to build flexible, resilient institutions. Foreign observers noticed the difference. Athenian writers mocked Spartans for their austerity and lack of culture. Persian envoys marveled at the discipline of the soldiers but expressed unease at the coldness of Spartan life. Even allies recognized that behind the gleaming shields lay a society drained of humanity. What impressed outsiders in times of war seemed hollow in times of peace. The erosion of trust also affected Sparta's ability to govern itself. A society built on fear can maintain control for a time, but fear breeds resentment. Among the Helots, the vast population of enslaved laborers, resentment simmered constantly, requiring harsh crackdowns and perpetual vigilance. Among women, silence was the norm, but silence is not the same as loyalty. The hidden shrines, the whispered prayers, the secret tokens of resistance found by archaeologists tell us that beneath outward compliance lay quiet defiance. The state could command obedience, but it could not command love. Over time, this poisoned environment contributed to Sparta's decline. Demographic collapse became a pressing problem. The population of full Spartan citizens dwindled, weakened by the physical toll of war and the psychological toll of its social system. High infant mortality, maternal deaths, and the emotional distance between spouses all combined to erode the city's numbers. By the Hellenistic period, Sparta was a shadow of its former self, unable to field the massive armies that had once terrified Greece. Historians debate the causes of Sparta's fall, pointing to military defeats, economic stagnation, and external pressures. Yet the internal decay cannot be ignored. A society that destroys trust between its own people cannot remain strong forever. The wedding night ritual, designed to enforce control, ultimately undermined the stability it sought to guarantee. By weaponizing intimacy, Sparta hollowed out the very bonds that make societies resilient. Modern scholars of domestic violence recognize the patterns clearly. The symptoms displayed by Spartan women, withdrawal, hypervigilance, self-blame, are familiar to survivors across time and culture. The silence imposed on them mirrors the enforced silence faced by victims in modern contexts. And just as in today's world, the damage extended far beyond the individual. It infected families, communities, and generations. The collapse of trust within Spartan society serves as a cautionary tale. Military strength may dazzle for a time, but no civilization can endure if it poisons the well of its own households. Love, partnership, and dignity are not luxuries. They are the glue that binds a people together. By stripping them away, Sparta built a society impressive in its discipline but fragile in its humanity. By the time Sparta entered its final centuries, the seeds of its destruction had long since been sown, not on the battlefield, but within its homes. The collapse of trust that began in the wedding chamber spread through generations, corroding the very bonds that sustained societies. For all its bronze armor and crimson cloaks, Sparta carried within itself a wound it could not heal. That wound, inflicted in silence upon its women, bled into every corner of its civic life until the city that once terrified Greece became a hollow echo of its former power. The decline was not sudden. For centuries, Sparta remained formidable, its warriors feared across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath the gleam of its reputation, the foundations cracked. Demographic decline was the most visible sign. With every generation, there were fewer citizens to fill the phalanx. Infant mortality remained high. Maternal deaths scarred families. And as the population of full-blooded Spartans dwindled, the state relied ever more desperately on a shrinking pool of men. By the Hellenistic era, the number of Spartan warriors had fallen so drastically that the once mighty city could barely muster the forces needed to defend itself. Historians point to the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE as a turning point, when Theban forces shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. But the deeper truth is that Sparta had already hollowed itself out long before. A society that sacrifices half its people to fear and silence cannot remain strong forever. Military defeat was only the visible symptom of an illness rooted in its own domestic life. The psychological scars of Spartan women contributed to this decline in ways often overlooked. Trauma does not remain isolated. It shapes behavior, relationships, and the raising of children. Mothers traumatized on their wedding nights carried their wounds into motherhood, struggling to nurture when they themselves had never been nurtured. Children raised in homes dominated by fear grew into adults accustomed to violence, lacking the emotional resilience that allows societies to adapt. Sparta's obsession with control left it brittle, unable to change in the face of new realities. The silence of Spartan women also robbed the city of its cultural depth. While Athens produced playwrights, philosophers, and historians whose works still shape our world, Sparta left behind little beyond its reputation for military discipline. The voices of half its population were silenced, their creativity stifled, their contributions erased. A society that could have been enriched by the talents of its women chose instead to break them. In doing so, it diminished itself. By the later centuries, foreign writers remarked not on Sparta's glory but on its stagnation. The city that once led all of Greece became an object of curiosity, a relic of harsher times. Visitors marveled at the strictness of its customs, but they no longer feared its armies. The machine of war, so carefully constructed, had lost its power because the society that fed it had poisoned itself from within. The lessons of this decline are not confined to the ancient past. They speak to a truth that echoes across civilizations: no society can endure if it destroys the trust and dignity of its own people. Military power may dazzle for a generation, but it cannot sustain itself without the bonds of love, respect, and cooperation that hold communities together. Fear may enforce obedience, but it cannot inspire loyalty. Silence may preserve order, but it cannot foster resilience. The story of Spartan wedding nights, with their calculated cruelty, is more than an ancient curiosity. It is a reminder of what happens when states weaponize intimacy, when governments treat human beings not as individuals but as instruments of policy. The screams of Spartan brides were not just the cries of young women in pain. They were the warning cries of a society sacrificing its soul for the illusion of strength. Even in decline, the rituals persisted. Archaeological evidence suggests that the practices of cutting hair, forcing cross-dressing, and isolating brides in dark chambers continued well into the later centuries. The inertia of tradition, once established, proved difficult to break. Families repeated the cycle not because it made them stronger, but because they knew no other way. The tragedy of Sparta lies not only in the cruelty itself, but in its endurance long after its purpose had faded. And yet, within this bleak picture, there is also resilience. The hidden shrines, the secret tokens buried in the earth, the quiet friendships between women, all testify to the human spirit's refusal to be fully extinguished. Spartan women may have been silenced, but they were not entirely erased. Their traces survive, whispering through history, reminding us that even in the darkest systems, people seek ways to preserve dignity. In reflecting on Sparta's fate, we confront a paradox. The society most admired for its discipline was undone by the very discipline it worshipped. The system that seemed unbreakable broke itself by denying the most basic human truths, that trust is stronger than fear, that love is a greater bond than domination, and that dignity cannot be sacrificed without cost. The lesson is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The fall of Sparta was not just the fall of a city. It was the collapse of an idea, that a society can thrive by silencing half its people, that fear can substitute for trust, that violence can be the glue that binds families together. History proved otherwise. The silence of women, the trauma passed from mother to daughter, the fear etched into the walls of wedding chambers, all these became part of the city's undoing. As we close this story, let us remember the voices that were never meant to be heard. The young brides who sat trembling in dark chambers, stripped of their identity, waiting for the door to burst open. The mothers who cradled children they could not protect. The daughters who grew up knowing their fates were sealed. Their pain was not a private sorrow. It was the quiet undoing of a civilization. Sparta fell not because its soldiers lost their edge, but because its society lost its soul. And that is the lesson history leaves us: strength built on fear is no strength at all. The true measure of a society lies not in the armies it fields, but in the dignity it grants to its people. When that dignity is denied, no walls, no spears, no shields can save it. The screams of Spartan brides have long since faded into silence. But if we listen closely, their echoes remain, a reminder that the greatest empires are not destroyed from without, but from within, when they choose control over compassion, and domination over love.